Welcome everyone to our latest I4CP Getting Hybrid Work Right call and our Next Practices Weekly series. Great to see so many names and faces from previous weeks. Great to see some new folks joining us as well. Please introduce yourself over in the chat. Would love to know where you're dialing in from today. We typically get folks from all across the United States and Canada, and usually some folks from Europe as well, even though it's a good deal later in the day there. So great to see so many parts of the world represented already. Keep the chat open throughout the call today. We'll be using that for you to interact. We usually get quite a lot of folks attending this call, and we want to be able to curate your questions and comments for our guest. If you're not familiar with I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We are a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. What we mean by that is companies that excel in revenue growth, market share profitability, and customer satisfaction. We're really looking for those practices that are leading edge, what we call next practices that organizations don't do very often, but that correlate to that higher performance when they do. We are a member-based organization. You see here just a small sample of our member companies. So I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone on the call who is with a member organization. If you're new to I4CP and are interested in what membership involves, what it includes, what it provides to you, feel free to reach out to anyone at I4CP, myself or anyone else. Just visit our website. We obviously have a contact form. Would love to be in touch with you. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and as is often the case, I'm joined this week by our CEO and co-founder, Mr. Kevin Oakes. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Tom. Good to be here, and I want to thank you and Zeta for continuing to put on a great show every week, and also acknowledge that great opening theme song we had today, 9 to 5. I'm not sure who picked that, but very appropriate.
Yeah, definitely an appropriate one. Shows us the different world we're in today, given the perspective from the lyrics there. We do have these meetings every Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific time. You see some of the topics we'll have coming up in upcoming weeks. Wanted to highlight two in mid and late February. We'll be circling back to getting hybrid work right as our topic, like we have today on the 23rd, when we'll be joined by Joanna and Annette from Experian. But I particularly wanted to highlight the February 16th session, which is going to be, once again, one of our favorite topics here at I4CP, and that is corporate culture. Kevin, that's going to be a special session with sort of you as the special guest, if you will. Say a few more words about that.
Yeah, well, next week we have a brand new study. It's called Culture Fitness, the healthy habits of high performance organizations. And that study will be coming out next week. We're excited by it because it's really building on some of the great work the research team did in culture renovation, which we wrote the book about afterwards. And it showcases just how important a healthy culture is to the financial performance of an organization, and equally how detrimental a toxic culture can be to organizations. And so we took liberty with the beginning of the new year. A lot of people focused on their fitness, and they've got their New Year's resolutions around their workout regimens. And we've created a workout regimen for corporations, and feel like it's a perfect time of year to think about the health of the culture of the organization. And we've got some very research-backed prescribed steps that people can take in order to get fitter in this new year.
Well, that sounds very interesting. Love the angle, love the, just especially given the time of year, like you said. So definitely encourage folks, if you, one thing to know about these calls, and once you register and get them on your calendar, we do record them. So we encourage you to join live. That way you can participate in the chat with comments and questions and everything. But that way too, it's just a reminder each week that the call is coming up. So I think you'll want to not miss, whether you can attend live or at least view the recording. That one on the 16th should be a special one. A couple of other quick announcements, and then we'll get to the conversation with our special guest today. The other thing to note about the Next Practices weekly call series is that it's now available as a podcast. We make it available through all the main podcast outlets, of course. We have a sort of separate intro that gets added to the actual interview guest portion of the show. So again, if you've got friends that are really into podcasts, might be more likely to listen to the content that way than they are to join a Zoom call or even watch a Zoom recording. We'd encourage you to share this with them and let them know that they can subscribe that way. As I mentioned earlier, we are a member-based organization. Many of our members, as well as non-members, join us once a year at our Next Practice Is Now conference, which is coming up fast at the end of March. So just over 2 months away. It's held each year in Scottsdale, Arizona. There is a virtual component to it as well. Obviously, for a couple of years, we weren't meeting in person due to COVID, but now we're doing both. We're already breaking records for the registrations and signups. So encourage folks to do that if you haven't already registered. Kevin, I know this is for us a big highlight of the year every year. What are your thoughts as you look at the speakers we've got lined up and just the anticipation for the event?
Well, as you already said, Tom, we are already breaking records. So we have more attendees coming to this conference than we've ever had in our history, and people are still registering, throughout every day and week here. We've still got room, so if you're interested in joining us, please join us in person. But that virtual option is a good one for folks as well.
Yeah. Also wanted to note a new content release that I personally was heavily involved with, and that is the third out of 3 workforce readiness guidebooks. And this one's on the topic of upskilling and reskilling. This follows on some earlier member-only guidebooks on creating a skills database as well as talent mobility. This is releasing, I believe, just today for I4CP members. So if you're an I4CP member on the call, I'd encourage you to go out to our website, download it. I believe Zeta has put the direct link in the chat there for you. This is the third, as I said, in this series of skills-related guidebooks coming out of I4CP. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kevin to introduce our special guest today.
All right, thanks, Tom, and welcome, Rachel. We're so thrilled to have you here with us today. Rachel, as you can see by the screen, is the Director of Flexible Work at Microsoft. And something I find fascinating is she took on that role over a year before the pandemic hit. So this is something that Microsoft has been thinking about for quite some time, obviously. And Rachel, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about your career journey at Microsoft. And certainly we want to get into what your current role entails.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And it's great to see everybody on the call and all the different places and companies that folks are calling in from. As you mentioned, I have been at Microsoft for many years, started there in 2006, and I've held a number of different roles, from product marketing to employee communications and engagement. And one of the great things about Microsoft is you can kind of create completely new careers without leaving the company, right? You have the opportunity to go work in a number of different functions and organizations. And that is no different to what happened in 2019. So I was in HR at the time, working in employee communications, and credit to the HR organization. They crafted a program with a role to lead the program called, at the time, Flexible Work vNext. And it was really designed to look ahead at the what if. What would we do if we wanted to expand access to flexibility at Microsoft? It was very forward looking, but it was also looking at like a 5 to 10 year plan. It was not something we expected to do or take action on immediately. So the good news is that in taking the role in 2019, I had a year to spend really focused on research, looking at the case for change. Why would we offer more flexibility? What would we offer if we did offer more flexibility? And I had the benefit of all of that time, wrote a white paper. It was a very kind of calm environment. And then COVID came and everyone went to work from home. And as you all remember, we weren't sure when offices would open. And so at the time, we thought maybe within the year, within a few months. And so we really fast-tracked a new set of guidelines. And we ended up kind of taking this 4 to 6 year plan and putting it into place in about 6 months. And in October of 2020, we launched our very first global guidelines on flexible work. Now, our offices didn't open for another year and a half, but we had those guidelines in place, and we had a lot of time to socialize and do the change management necessary to introduce our company to the new flexible work guidelines. And so I very much credit Microsoft with the foresight, and also really appreciate the year I had to think about this topic prior to everyone kind of really focusing on how do we do this going forward.
And Rachel, who was really driving that to begin with? I do think it's great foresight to start this a year ahead of time. I'm just curious, why? What was the impetus to do that?
Well, I think the impetus was, I credit, up to Kathleen Hogan, our CHRO, they were all aware of what continues to be true, which is that flexible work is a strategic business decision. It isn't kind of a perk or privilege or nice to have, right? And I think that recognizing the value to the company for driving talent attraction, driving talent retention, employee well-being, employee autonomy, I think there was a general recognition that this was valuable as a business decision, and also as something that we could offer our employees. And so I think we continued to see that, and we see that today as well. And it's been, it's held true. And so I think there was, that was the recognition, I think, that came from HR saying, hey, let's see what we can do more of to offer.
Yeah. I love that you just said that about it being a strategic decision. We produced a research report just a few weeks ago on priorities and predictions for 2023. And in it, we said flexible work is a strategy, not a concession. And I think in a lot of organizations, they've treated it more as a concession, right? They've reluctantly gone into it. But that's something I've always appreciated about Microsoft. You, from the start, have seemed to treat this as something that is strategic to the organization going forward. And your philosophy has been to provide as much flexibility as possible, right? And yeah. I'm curious about the as possible part, because that's sort of the crux of it. So how do you define that as possible part?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So one thing I'll say is, and I agree, and I am proud of the approach Microsoft has taken, which is that we took a very data-driven approach, and we were not headline grabbing, and in the sense that our goal was to deliver a thoughtful and intentional approach to flexible work, and not and in 2.5 years since we've launched our guidelines, we have not changed them. And I know you've seen in the media a lot of big headlines, work from anywhere, and then you've also seen a lot of big retractions, and you see this kind of this back and forth going on, and we have stayed the course. We were thoughtful and intentional. We knew that we would evolve over time. We made a commitment at the start, and so that's been really something we're very, very proud of and maintain. And as you said, our commitment as a whole, I would say, kind of our overarching approach to flexibility, is to offer as much flexibility as possible while balancing the needs of the individual, the needs of the business, and the needs of our culture. So kind of let's think about that, kind of that general principle in two ways. One is to what end, right? And we talked about that, right? We know there's a business decision, a business outcome that benefits everyone, right? The employee, the team, and the business. And then as possible, what we've offered in our guidelines, and they're publicly available if anybody would like to look at them, what they did was establish a set of standard offerings. So everyone at Microsoft, with very few exceptions, can work from home up to 50% of the time. And that is kind of standard across the roles. And then there's more flexibility available across work site and work locations with manager approval. And so what we looked at was there's no one size fits all at Microsoft. I think many of you probably are familiar with the scale and scope of Microsoft. It's about 220,000 employees in more than 90 countries. So we knew there was not going to be a one size fits all approach. So we've worked with managers. So we've offered a standard set of offerings, schedule flexibility also being part of our standard. And then we have said to managers, we really encourage you to get to yes. And the way we get to yes is we think about the nature of the work that the employee is doing and consider how can we enable the employee to work the way they work best? Not all roles are equally well suited to working either offsite or in different locations or not co-located with their team. But one thing we do look at is that it is, as I mentioned in the beginning, it isn't based on performance or tenure or perk or privilege. This is really trying to take a fairly objective approach to, can the work be done in the way the employee wants to do it? And does it work for the individual, for the team, and for the business? And the team, I'll focus on that. I think that's become, as an entity, more important over time, which is that it is, while it is an individual way of working, the important factor is, can it work for the team? We look a lot at the team as a unit. We provide guidance to managers on how to build team agreements. Those team agreements are kind of not established at a corporate level, but they are established individually. How do we work best together? How do we make sure that we're available to each other, that if we have interdependent tasks, we're available to connect, and we're continuing to be productive and effective and connected.
I love that. I think so little has been written about, or so little time paid towards the team dynamic here. As you look at across organizations, most individuals spend the majority of their time working as part of a team, and I think it's important to figure out as a team, what's going to work best to accomplish your goals. So I think that's fantastic. Now, you mentioned you're in 90 countries. We had one question already in the chat. Have you seen any differences globally in this approach?
Let me make sure I understand the question. Have we seen differences in how our geographic locations have approached flexibility, or how our global footprint has changed?
No, just flexibility. So what changes or what differences are you seeing in your global offices from a flexibility perspective?
Well, so that's an interesting question. And one thing we have seen is a lot of countries, or a kind of an increasing number of countries, are actually crafting legislation and local regulations related to flexible work. And those are often kind of what does a company become accountable for, maybe in covering home office expenses, what are some of the rules in place? And of course, local legislation is our kind of, reigns supreme. So while our corporate guidelines may say one or two things, local legislation will always be something we look to first to say what is allowed in that country. But it's been really interesting to see countries in different ways embrace flexible work and put in place employee protections. And so it's wonderful to see that.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, culturally, are there different attitudes towards flexibility that you found in some of those different countries? I've certainly read, a lot of reports about how Europe is probably a little bit more back to office than some other parts of the world are. And, I'm just curious if you're seeing some of that, change when you rolled out these policies across your global offices.
Well, I'd say this, there were countries who were pioneering flexible work long before COVID. In fact, that year that I spent studying flexible work, a lot of countries in Europe, as you mentioned, showed up on my radar as kind of doing things differently. Netherlands comes to mind. Really, they were very much ahead of the curve in looking at, what kind of flexibility can we offer? How do we rearrange our space to accommodate the ebb and flow of employees who are coming into the office with intentionality, right? We kind of joked about the music introing this event, and it was a bit ironic, which is that 9 to 5 has long since kind of departed in many countries, and I think you're seeing that here as well, which is that you come in with intention, you work when you work best. And so we really looked at a lot of those countries to learn what was possible. It gave us an important benchmark to say, this does work, it can work, the culture can be maintained, people do still come in for the right reasons. And so we really have learned a lot, I would say, from a lot of cultures. There are other cultures where flexible work is new, but I would argue the US is one of those cultures. We are not the biggest embracers of flexible work as a country. We have this Monday through Friday 9 to 5 standard that is taking a lot of effort to convince everybody and to build the skill set to work under that. Trust and accountability are a big part of that.
Yeah, certainly that's the case when there's entire songs written about the 9 to 5, as we just saw. It's definitely ingrained in the culture when it's in the music. Wanted to interject here with a couple questions from the chat. Heather asked, you had noted 50% was sort of the baseline, and then beyond that, it's manager approval. What does 50% mean, though? How is that created? Is it weekly, monthly, yearly?
Yeah.
What's the time frame for 50%?
It's a great question. Well, so what I'll start is by saying that one of the first things we did was define our hybrid workplace, and we established and defined the hybrid workplace across 3 dimensions. Work site, which is the physical space where you work. I'm in my home office today. There's an office on campus. Where you work physically is your work site. Your work location is your geographic location where you work, and then you have work hours. And in defining those 3 dimensions, within those, we establish what is our flexible work approach. So the 50% that I mentioned was 50% ability to work from home or work offsite, and that is considered average per week for the foreseeable future. And it is interesting, we have very, very detail-oriented employees. So this has been something where, we've talked a lot about this is an average, this is for the foreseeable future, this is not about vacations, this isn't about clocking in and clocking out, but on average, you're coming in some portion of the week. And if you don't want to come in at all on any given week or on average, then that's where you put in maybe a request to work from home a larger portion of time. For work location, it's really about requesting a change to your work location. It could be in country or across to another country. We allow that. We have processes in place. It's more complex. I know a lot of why I think a lot of companies had to retract and or shift their policies is because it's a complex environment of tax and payroll, right? I think some people, particularly some employees, don't really appreciate the complexity of offering flexibility, particularly work location flexibility. Again, we offer as much as possible, and maybe, Kevin, this goes back to your question. Some of the as possible are rules that are out of our hands, like tax requirements, local legislation, payroll requirements, et cetera. So those are the things. So that's the 50% that is really primarily looking at working from home.
I think also you're being a little kind in terms of what some other companies have done. I think some have had to retract some of their policies because they weren't nearly as intentional as Microsoft has been here. And they had sort of arbitrary edicts that they've had to walk back. Another comment from the chat, though, or question from Kelly. You mentioned about teams and that being one of the ways in which you judge all of this, the individual, the team, the organization, the culture you mentioned. But there's now more and more people are on more than one team, of course, not just their department team, but project teams and various matrices. So how do you handle that, where maybe the needs of one team's different than the needs of the other team you're on? That could get complicated pretty quickly.
It really can. And I appreciate the question because it's a really important distinction. There are hierarchical teams, but more often than not, the team that you are collaborating with on a daily basis is, what I think Microsoft calls them virtual teams, but what they are is teams formed without direct reporting lines. They're teams that you work on for a project or an initiative. And you're absolutely right. People work on multiple V teams. And I think the key is that it is hard. It is about, figuring out what works best, applying some best practices, and really looking at how can you work in a way that works for all the teams that you're working on? Now, the interesting thing about virtual teams is they don't tend to live on forever, right? So you could be on multiple projects today and those projects will change. And so I think it is about being flexible in how you work and looking to your teams to say, how do we coordinate and align in the best way possible? And like I said, we've put out a lot of resources around what we call team agreements. And some of that helps teams consider, how do we make this work for everyone?
You know, we in thinking about what other companies have done, I've written a couple articles around the fact that a lot of those policies seem to be CEO driven and purely by CEO preference about being in the office 9 to 5, et cetera. And some of those policies seem to have just ignored any data and research. And I love that you personally have been so focused on research, Rachel, and that you guys are utilizing data quite a bit in these decisions. And somebody had asked about measuring employee behaviors. It's something they always appreciated about Microsoft. What measurements are you looking at right now for office utilization and just thinking about some of those employee measures? What do you find to be most illuminating to making decisions going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Data is an important part of how we make decisions. I'm sure maybe you've heard Satya kind of uses a phrase. He says we put data over dogma, and it absolutely applies to flexible work. I think what you're describing as the corporate preference or the CEO, preference is very much dogmatic, right? We're going to do it this way, and this is the way we're going to approach it. And Microsoft has, really valued a few things. And so I can describe a little bit of how we've taken data to make these decisions. The first is that we have a really robust employee listening system at Microsoft. We look at not only do we have an annual survey that goes out that looks at just an enormous amount of measures of employee sentiment, but we have something we call our daily pulse, which is actually a sampling of employees get a survey every day. And we are able to kind of put in questions, research questions that looks and captures trends over time. So it's not just the moment in time, but we're always getting this feedback. The feedback includes not only answers to survey questions, but also open-ended questions. So we see a lot of anecdote and verbatim, which is really a healthy way. I often immerse myself in the verbatim because the nuance in how people talk and how people provide feedback is important. But we look at the employee listening system. That is one thing we do. And so we're always able to look at trends. And we've asked some specific questions. Are you able to work effectively no matter where you work? Do you have a quality of connection with your coworkers? Do you believe that Microsoft values flexible work? I mean, we want to understand, do people feel like this is, that the commitment we've made is feeling, are they feeling that commitment? Are they feeling that approach? The second thing we do is really look at industry trends and drive our own internal research and analysis. This allows us to look at what's next, kind of build solutions. One of the things that we're looking at right now, which is very, very top of mind, is research around when in-person matters, right? I think that we know that being together in person has value. There's value on a number of building social capital, building social ties, working on certain types of work. But what we look at and what we've studied is to really decide before making a decision, let's say, Tuesdays and Wednesdays in the office, is that really the way to extract the most value of being together in person? And I'll tell you, our research determined that it's actually not days per week. It's not a discrete measure of time, but it's actually about coming together intentionally for moments that matter. And the study and the research showed us moments that matter where we can be thoughtful and intentional with our teams about coming together. And that means prioritizing travel budget if needed. We don't see the data does not tell us, the research does not tell us that it's about frequency, but it's really about that intentionality. So that's a great example of like very much where we are right now. And one of the ways we see the dogma out in the world and we say, hey, let's challenge that. Let's look at what the research tells us what to do. Let's be thoughtful and intentional.
I'd love to dive into this a little bit more because, we've gotten some questions just around, what are the main reasons you're finding people come into the office? And you just talked about, moments that matter and being thoughtful and intentional about that. Is there more specifics around where you see it really matter for, certain groups inside the organization?
We have. I can share, some top of mind that we've noted in the research. We're still in the process of doing our research and validating, but some early insights do include the new, what I would call new enroll or new to team. This is an opportunity for when in-person matters. It matters to connect with your manager, and it matters to connect with your team. We find in the research that if it facilitates onboarding, it builds those social capital, that social ties, and it really helps create common ground, trust, all of these important outcomes that are really critical at the start of a new role or when you're new to the team, which doesn't mean that you're onboarding to Microsoft. It could, but it could also mean internal moves to a new team. Similar to that, we have also found that the when in person matters at certain points in a project, and we see that it starts at project kickoff, which also often includes a new team formation. And so we feel like the research is telling us that coming together in person at the start of a project or as a team is forming can really build the momentum that can carry you through, even if you don't meet again through the duration of the project. That point is very, very important. I think some of the things that we found in the research is the transfer of tacit knowledge, creating those common grounds, sharing information, and that can happen when in person. So those are two examples of when it matters, and they're very actionable, as you can tell. Right, we can identify and invest in those moments, knowing, okay, are you starting a new project or team? Great, like let's invest in bringing your team together. If you're co-located, there's no cost there. If you're not co-located, there may be some travel budget that's needed. But if we know that, we can really action on it.
On the first of those that you mentioned, if you're new to Microsoft, completely new, so onboarding, Sonia was wondering, what is the onboarding process like at Microsoft now?
Well, it's a very, very in-depth program, and it's called our new employee onboarding program. I won't go into too much detail, but it is definitely, we look at, your first engagement with Microsoft is really bringing everyone through not just an introduction to the company, but an introduction to our culture. As you probably know, we have a very unique culture. We're very proud of our culture, and it's important, and it's an important opportunity for people to become connected to the culture. So we do have a robust new employee onboarding process. I probably won't go into it in detail because I think that's a whole nother show and a whole nother practice. And I would probably defer to my colleagues to share more there.
You just talked a little bit about culture, Rachel. Have you seen any shifts in the culture since the pandemic and since your shift to flexibility?
Well, one of the things that we look at is, I think I mentioned in the beginning that we have a clear belief that flexibility is a driver of some of our outcomes. It is a driver of things like talent retention and attraction and employee well-being. We also believe, though, that we can maintain certain parts of our company with a hybrid workplace. And so we've looked less at where culture has changed and more at really being happy to see that our culture has maintained in the spirit of in the face of a hybrid workplace. So I think there was some concern that what if people can't get together? What if people are more less co-located, more distributed, working from home more, what would happen to our culture? And I think for the most part, we've seen that we've been able to maintain our culture in wonderful ways. And so that's really what we're looking at, less about driving it in a different direction and more about maintaining the kind of essence of what we hold true as part of our culture.
I think one of the big criticisms of working remotely is a loss of productivity. And I've heard this from, lots of different CEOs who have used that as an excuse to get people back into the office. I'm curious if you've done a lot of research on the productivity of the workforce and what you've found in your approach.
Yeah, the challenge in that case, under any circumstances, unless you are producing quantifiable widgets in some way, is what is productivity? For a knowledge worker, you have a variety of outputs that are not always measurable. I mean, how do you measure creativity and innovation and all of the parts that make us collectively productive? And so I would start by saying it is a very undefined measure. And so to look at productivity is hard to do and probably inaccurate if you really tried to kind of pinpoint productivity went up, productivity went down. The things I will say is that we do look at various metrics of employee thriving, whether we look at our overall business measures. We do have some areas where we're kind of considering there are more specific outputs, and I would say that we have not felt there has been a change to productivity. What I also hear a lot in the pushback is, well, what if an employee works from home and doesn't get as much done, right? What if they're not able to work from home? And I would say two things there. One is, performance management is performance management, right? We know, and that doesn't change. Our expectations for performance don't change based on where you work. And so what is the challenge, though, is that if you cannot see an employee every day, are you very clear, and you being the manager or the leader, are you very clear what is expected? What are the expectations? What does the output look like for a workload? And what are we seeing, and what does success look like? And what is the impact you're expected to have? And it is less about the activity and more about the output. One of the things that we also are working with managers on, because it's very hard to identify, but we know it exists, is bias. And there's kind of three biases that tend to come up in this case, which is, proximity bias, affinity bias, face-time bias. So our people, we are challenging ourselves and challenging our managers to say, well, make sure that bias isn't coming into you. I see this person every day at their desk. I don't see this other person. Make sure that I'm measuring them, equally around how they're doing their job by output and not by what I see happening in front of me. And so that's actually very, very something we're very aware of. And we, I won't go deep into bias. It's not my area of expertise, but I do know that being aware of it is half the battle. So can you challenge managers during performance reviews to remind themselves that there are people you see and people you don't, and be aware of these biases, and then you kind of you're able to challenge yourself to say, am I bringing any of this to my decision making or to my evaluation?
Well, I love what you just said, though, about focusing on goals, focusing on objectives. We've actually got a brand new study that we're launching soon, specifically on that, really looking at how are managers managing to objectives inside their organization. The hypothesis there is that we'll see the pendulum swing more towards that versus location, of the employee, which is kind of a silly thing to measure people on. But since you brought up managers, let's go a little bit deeper into that. I think we all feel managers are so critical to this equation in making this work. I'm just wondering what kind of support you've been providing to managers in this new flexible and hybrid world.
Well, I've talked a little bit about a few of them. One of them is kind of helping managers with the decision-making process when they are faced with requests for changes to work site, work location, and work hours, right? So there's the overarching get to yes, helping them with the decision-making, being objective, looking at the nature of work. That would be one. The other thing we've offered is a lot of general resources around how to work in a hybrid workplace, how to conduct meetings well, how to be inclusive. When we think about teams, we really look at how to make them productive, connected, and inclusive. And a lot of that relies on the manager of the team or even the leader of the V team, again, recognizing that teams come in different forms. I think one of the things where we're continuing to get better is just recognizing that working in a hybrid workplace is a skill and a capability. And we have a lot of work to do to build that skill and capability. In fact, some of what the research shows today is that being in person may be different for teams of different tenure or who have worked in a distributed way for longer. And what that says to us is that there are people and teams that are better at it. And that means there's a skill. And how do we build that skill and capability? So that's not just managers, that's everybody who works in a hybrid workplace. So that's that kind of focus on skills and capability building. I know that's a big part of the industry writ large right now in HR. And I think recognizing the first step will be recognizing kind of working in a hybrid workplace as its own skill and capability and something people can recognize. And then leading or managing a hybrid team would also fit into that category as a skill and capability that we'll build in our managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I personally, I love hearing you say that. I have been a hybrid virtual leader, manager and employee for multiple firms going back 20 years now. And I actually gave a talk on the skills needed to be a virtual leader back in 2013 at, of all places, a Microsoft conference. I think on our prep call, I told you this. It was the Microsoft Convergence Conference in 2013, and my talk was on virtual leadership skills. And back then, it was mostly about people that had distributed teams across the globe, say, folks in India, folks in the US, and you're leading this virtual team. So what's involved there? And one of the things I stressed was exactly what you're talking about today when you mentioned the team operating agreements. So I'm glad to hear that that's something you've put in place. Is that one of the ways that you're providing support to managers and leaders? Is there like a template that you provide for them? Because that's something that you say that everyone nods their head and says, oh, that's a good idea, a team operating agreement. In fact, we probably should have had those all along, even for intact in-person teams. Why not? Just to clarify things and get it written down. But is that something where HR maybe created a template, or did you take some of the best examples as exemplars from some of your best leaders? How have you gone down that road?
Yeah, it's a good question. We did create a template of sorts, kind of a guide, but I will distinguish between what I would call a capital T, capital A team agreement and a lowercase t, lowercase a team agreement. And we really focus on the latter. There is no expectation that someone fills something out or logs it with some system, right? One of the things we try to do with our managers is remove the unnecessary processes and tools. And so we've provided templates to managers just to say, these are things to think about. These are conversations to have. These are ways that you can connect and align and create that common ground. So we do provide a lot of guidance. One of the things that you mentioned about kind of 2013 that made me think about an important part of Microsoft's evolution is that, by the definition of a hybrid workplace, right, a mix of work site, work location, and work hours, Microsoft has had a hybrid workplace for years. In fact, almost since our inception, we've had a global footprint. We've served customers around the world. We've worked at various hours. And so what really is the evolution is what we call into a hybrid workplace that is kind of built to some degree on flexibility. And we think about something what is an important phrase we think about and use is called hybrid by design. And what that is really thinking about How do we operate in a hybrid workplace to optimize the best possible outcomes of all of the various experiences? Where it is distinct is that we are not always hybrid first in a hybrid by design world. Hybrid by design means we may look at a learning activity and say, you know what, this is better done all in person. And we may look at another scenario and say, this is better done with everybody virtual. And we'll study that. And again, we'll look at the data and we'll make those decisions. And that is, again, part of, I know we keep saying this, part of the intentionality is being hybrid by design as a company. We embrace this hybrid workplace. We make this hybrid workplace work. And I think if that's where I would say we are today, it's really how do we make the hybrid workplace work? And it's all of those things. It's manager capability, it's building the guidance and resources, it's looking at space. I mean, some of it goes far beyond flexibility, right? How do we look at space? How do we build the tools and technology needed to be great in a hybrid workplace and to be successful in a hybrid workplace? And so there's a lot that goes into it to making hybrid work. And I know you call this getting hybrid work right. I think it's a journey. We'll be on that journey for a while for sure.
Yeah, that's why we've always called it getting, because it implies that it's an ongoing process. I just wanted to note, I'm glad you brought up the hybrid training example. We did a survey about a year ago now with regard to hybrid training, and we found more organizations were doing what you just said, or at least implied, not often trying to actually have a literally hybrid synchronous learning event where some people are gathered in a room and some people are online. That's a very challenging thing to do. There are ways to do it better. And I've actually written an article with some best practices on that out at our website if you're going to go down that road. But more often we find that if you've got some people that are remote, then either you need to bring them in and have it be an in-person ILT, or you need to have everyone be remote so that it equalizes the experience. That's just what we have found more high-performing organizations are looking at. So good to hear you're got a similar approach, it sounds like.
Well, hybrid is very rarely the path of the easiest path.
Right.
As I said before, you really, the commitment to flexibility is because we believe that what it can bring to the company is valuable, and it's clear why we want to make this commitment. And it's important to have that as your North Star because it's hard. Hybrid is not the easiest route. It is easier to be all virtual or all in person. And we recognize that. And so I think any company that goes the route of a hybrid workplace has their work cut out for them. And so it's very important to remind yourself, why are we doing this? Why do we care? What is our commitment? What do we believe this can bring to our employees and to our business?
Well, and you're also being very innovative, though. I'll put in a little plug for Microsoft here. We had Jared at our conference last year and showcasing some of the newer technologies and things that you're doing with Teams, for instance, to make that whole experience a lot more equitable, no matter where somebody is located, if they're in person or hybrid. So I think we're very early in this process of, I think, having some technology solutions that'll make this a heck of a lot easier.
I agree, Kevin, and that's such a great point. One of our commitments internally is to be customer zero on our own products. We learn an enormous amount about where we can build our products, grow our products, and our products can help our customers because we use them in our own hybrid workplace. And so we know that to be true. And one thing we also recognize, I mentioned the research around when in-person matters. In-person is not always possible, whether due to budget constraints or time or our ability to travel, whatever it ends up being, it isn't always an option. And technology is a great way to normalize and equalize, as you mentioned, the experience, right? So if we know this is better done in person, that doesn't mean, our research shows that it's easier to do this in person, but it doesn't mean it has to be done in person. And so that brings up your skill set and your technology, and a combination of the two is what makes it possible if that's not an option for you. So yeah, Jared and his team and the modern work team, it's really the innovation that they're driving is so extraordinary and kind of allows hybrid work to work as much as any of the internal policies do.
And Rachel, you know that we've done a lot of research on collaboration and connectivity inside of organizations. We're big fans of organizational network analysis and really studying how is some of that collaboration happening. We had just had a question from Ann White, who said that some of her team members are in office locations with very few members of their immediate team. So do you focus on connection activities within work locations that bring together the local office community?
That is actually very top of mind right now. And what I would say is this, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. There is no doubt that if you are in a place where you're near an office, and in that office, there are people who don't work on your team, the research tells us that there is still value in coming together. And one of those outcomes is to mitigate social isolation and burnout, right? You can just connecting with other people, connecting with people at the company. It can build weak ties. It can mitigate burnout. It can avoid social isolation. All of that is extremely valuable. So I would say, yes, there's value to coming together in person. Is it going to drive maybe the outcome measures around team effectiveness, right? Well, maybe not, right? You're not coming in and you're not working with the people that you work with on a daily basis. You're not working with the people for whom you have a collective charter to deliver something. So when we think about, in fact, we were just having this conversation on our team the other day, which is like, well, should we bring people together who are all working on the same organization in Atlanta, maybe not in the same team? And the answer is absolutely, there's value there, right? There's value to coming together, to creating that social connection. Networks and communities are also something that extend beyond your work teams, right? Can you create networks of people who, we have our employee resources group. So other parents, maybe you have a connection with, or women at Microsoft. Those communities are important. Building your networks are important. So it really, though, is if you bring them together with the intent of driving team effectiveness, that's where the disconnect may be, right? Be aware of what you're driving and what is your purpose for bringing people together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're talking about this right now. It'd be interesting over time. Like you said, data over dogma, and I know you do so much research and employee listening. It would be interesting to see if there's an impact on employee engagement scores or other metrics like that, and be able to do some, if not intentional, maybe by accident, A/B testing, where you note that the Atlanta office maybe has these kind of events monthly or quarterly. Some other office you happen to know doesn't. Is there any sort of noticeable difference in some metrics over time because of that?
Absolutely. I mean, those opportunities, one of the benefits of being a company as large as Microsoft is the opportunity to experiment and learn from our own kind of employees, and our own recognizing that the opportunity to understand what's happening with our own employees is huge. And that's just but I think any company can do that, right? Which is experiment, invest in doing one thing a certain way with a team, and then measure the outcomes. That's how we're going to move the needle forward. That's how we're going to build those skills and capabilities, is identifying best practices. Maybe like you said, if you see, we often look at data to see if there's a country, maybe you talked a little bit about culture, a country that pops, or a certain organization that has higher numbers. Well, then the work begins, right? When then you go to that org and say, hey, what are you guys doing differently? What's happening there? And it takes a little bit of digging, right? It's not immediately obvious. Maybe the leader, maybe it's leader modeling, right? It could be a lot of different things, but you have to dig a little bit to find what is driving those numbers. And you always want to look for those anomalies, right? So we do, the real challenge is asking the right questions, right? And it's the data is there if we ask the right questions. And that, of course, I partner with, we have a very extensive business analytics team. We have a research team called New Future of Work. These are deep partners of ours, and they help us ask the right questions.
On that, I was also one area where I know several years ago, I think this was pre-pandemic, where Microsoft did an intentional test, was I believe Microsoft Japan was one of the first to be documented as looking at the 4-day work week as an alternative model. Is that something that Microsoft is still researching and considering? I know it's sort of taken root in Europe a lot of research and a lot of companies looking at the 4-day work week instead of 5 days. I'm wondering, is that under your remit as something part of flexible work or work models that you're looking at as well?
Well, the good news is that as we built out our flexible work program, we maintained a portion of the program that looks at flexible work vNext, right? So we're consistently, so we kept the moniker of vNext because we always do want to be very forward looking in where we are looking ahead to what's next. How can we expand our offerings? How can we offer more flexibility? And while the 4-day work week, I think, has a lot of we need to continue to work to see, is that the right answer? What it is showcasing is that while we focused a lot on work site and work location as our kind of, at this point, almost table stakes for many companies, Rich, is that work site and work location, okay, we need to create flexibility there. But what about work hours? What about when people work? What about part-time? What about flexible work hours? What about looking at the concept of Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and what can we do differently? How can we apply a growth mindset there? So while I think the 4-day work week is one kind of version of it that some folks are looking at, we would probably say the opportunity is more broadly in looking at work hours and how can we offer different ways of working there. I think there's been less innovation there, and there's an enormous amount of opportunity.
And you just rolled out unlimited PTO, so it almost seems to obfuscate, the need for that 4-day work week conversation, with unlimited PTO. I know that it's somewhat controversial, and there's pluses and minuses to unlimited PTO, but that is the ultimate flexibility, really, that you're providing to your employees.
That's right. And it comes back to trust and accountability, right? We get to a point as a company where we know what success looks like. Everyone feels super confident that they know what work they're doing. They know where to go to get help and support if they need it. And then they have the ability to work the way they work best. And the way they work best could be about hours of the day. It could be about location. It could be about site. And so we're really, I think, embracing trust and also looking toward accountability. And that will be the key to success going forward.
Well, I think we're probably just wrapping up here, Rachel. So I want to make sure I take the time to thank you for joining us. This has been fascinating. We love working with Microsoft. You've been a great partner of ours. Hopefully we can have you back and also partner on some of this research that you're looking at. It's something that we continue to spend a lot of time on, and I believe it's going to be a topic that's going to be a bit evergreen for a couple of years now. We're really at the start of, I think, discovering some new ways of working here. Tom, anything you'd like to say and wrap up?
Well, I certainly want to thank Rachel as well. Great conversation. You're getting a lot of kudos over in the chat. And yeah, Kevin, when we discussed this Thursday call series a few months back going into the new year, we talked about, well, should we continue to have getting hybrid work right be on the list of topics we look at regularly, and we discussed it and said, yes, absolutely, we need to keep it on the radar, because like you say, for probably the next year or two, most organizations, including Microsoft, are going to keep continuing to innovate and continue to learn the best approaches to take in this new way of working. So I'll just wrap with again a reminder of our next Practices Now conference, which is in late March. As I said earlier, we're seeing record registrations, but we would love folks to still sign up. A lot of organizations are bringing not just their CHRO or other senior member of the HR team, but bringing, using it as a development opportunity, bringing multiple people from their HR organization. So we're seeing a lot of that this year as well. So encourage you to come to join us in Scottsdale. I live in Rochester, New York, so I also look forward to it from a weather perspective. It's a lovely location, and you see the many great speakers we've got lined up here,
including Joe Whittinghill, your peer.
Good
there,
point.
Rachel. And Joe's a great friend and a great speaker. Always has a lot of very interesting things to share.
All right. So if you have more questions about flexible work, he'd be the perfect person to ask.
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, very good. Well, once again, thank you, Rachel, for being our guest today. Great conversation. And thank you, as always, Kevin. Appreciate it, and appreciate all of you for being participants on the call today. Lots of great questions were surfaced. We weren't able to get to all of them, but we got to as many as we could. And thank you for joining us each Thursday. Hope to see you again next week. Have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks again, Rachel.
Thank you.